Oh my god. So, Steph, what are you doing here? What's going on?
Well, there's been some very spooky accusations that have reached my ears.
Oh no.
I've heard tell around the stable that there are some misconceptions about what maybe CSS Grid can do for you.
Oh my
So I'm
goodness,
here
that's
to set the
horrible.
record straight.
Oh, please do. That's so scary that people have misconceptions about that. What can we do?
Well, I do believe the best thing is to show what the powers are so that you will have a magic wand or your magical tool of choice at the ready when you encounter a scary situation. Yes.
I agree. I absolutely agree. Should we do this on my screen or on yours?
I
I don't
believe if you
remember.
would show the magic cauldron,
Yes.
we'll
I do
beam
have
some
a
magic over to
thing
it.
to click. I'm just this is very serious and I take it seriously. Wait, I swear I clicked it. There we go. Okay, so interesting. So we've got this stack of divs. What do you want me to do here, Steph?
So, Alex, what we have here is a series of divs, and I'm going to drop my accent mostly because I don't want it to be annoying to everyone.
You were faking it?
I mean, I can keep it up, or we can get a little bit of a different one going. I don't know, but I'm very used to doing accents, doing all the characters in the books and so forth. Also, I've been watching Great British Bake Off way too much recently. Anyway, let's get into it. So we've got a series of divs, 5 of them, as you can see. And let's first talk about, so what are these misconceptions? So the one that comes up still is browser compatibility. And this makes me sad. Grid has been supported in our Evergreen browsers since October 2017. That's when we have cross-browser Evergreen support. So Chrome, Safari, Edge on Chromium, and Firefox. And so, first of all, it's supported. Please start using it. Please remove that misconception for yourself and your team. Secondly, and this is one that kept me from using it for a solid 2 years, which was that I thought it was only for page layout. So I can understand how that's still a misconception. So we're going to talk about using it for micro layout. And also that you had to predetermine and count rows and columns. I also wasn't into that spell. So we're going to learn some new tricks on what we can do instead. And also, the last major one I see is that folks think you can only use Grid or Flexbox. And also, not true. I use them frequently within the same components, and you can too. So let's go ahead and I will work some magic on my end that should display on your end. So you can see in our HTML, we just have a simple div class container, our very generic elements here. We'll hide that away now that we know what it looks like. And so we know that's our class container. And very simply, we're going to apply display grid. Now we haven't seen a change. This is our first stark difference. If you haven't looked into Grid and you're wondering what is the initial difference between Grid and Flexbox, and this is it right here. Whereas Flexbox, we'd be used to them jumping up next to each other in column alignment. Grid is default to row. So that's your first difference. So let's give ourselves a little bit of gap so we can kind of see what the difference is between our elements a little more easily. And so that's great, but not exactly useful other than gap. Gap is great. And by the way, gap is fully supported in Flex now as well. So if that has been one of the reasons you maybe were misusing Grid, just an FYI about that. So if we do want this to behave more in a Flexbox sort of way, I'm going to make one change here. So as you saw, we are in CodePen, and I'm going to use emit here. I just want a little bit of variation between the content.
I did not know about the parenthesis trick. That's really nice.
Handy dandy.
Yeah.
All right, so I just wanted a little bit of difference in the lengths here. If we wanted this to take on a slightly more Flexbox behavior and go into a line next to each other, the property you're looking for that is grid autoflow and switching that to column. Now we see they have jumped in a line. And we also see that they are taking on their intrinsic widths here. And looks like it's not quite as smooth of me resizing, but it does look like you are seeing that resize.
Yes.
Now, the problem here, another reason folks might choose to not choose grid, is that, as you can see, we've got an overflow issue. And it doesn't look like I'm tracking my scroll on your screen, Alex, but I think it's pretty clear that it's been cut off a bit.
Yes, yeah.
This definitely has its uses, though. In more smaller, more controlled spaces, it can be a handy little trick to just flip that axis. So what if we do want to be cognizant of more flexibility, maybe a behavior slightly closer to what we're used to with Flexbox? Let's look at what that is. So I've taken off of our auto flow, and I'm going to change my method here to use grid template columns. And this is my favorite trick. If you have seen me before, you have heard me talk about this, but I will continue repeating it because it is a wonderful trick to have.
Do. Yeah.
So we are going to use several grid functions and features in this one line. First, we're setting up the repeat function. This means do what I'm going to tell you to do for however many elements I define it for.
It's quite queenly of you to demand it in such a way.
Yes, it is a demand. You are correct. In this case, we could do something simple and say 1 and use the FR unit, 3, and they've now jumped to equal space columns, and that's definitely useful if that's the behavior you're after. We still hit, though, our overflow issue. So
spooky.
We're going to... What's that?
That's spooky.
It's
overflows are terrifying.
They are. They can be quite unsettling. Yes. So we're going to choose AutoFit as our first update. It's not going to actually cause any change in behavior yet because we need to provide additional parameters. So we're going to use the grid exclusive function of min-max. And just for today, we're going to use a simplified version. I'm going to say 15ch as my minimum. Ch, for those unfamiliar, is the width of the 0 character in the inherited font at that point in time. So 15ch and as our minimum, and then we're going to allow it to grow using 1fr. So now as I resize, once we get below a point at which the elements would not be able to hold multiple elements with at least 15ch of room, they drop down, create new roles, and it's essentially like the Flexbox wrap behavior. So you can see there's some differences in that, namely, the elements do stay in their grid columns. And that is one other reason folks may choose to still use Flexbox in this scenario. We cannot use alignment properties such as justify to force that last one to be centered. It's going to always retain its grid behavior. So that can be a gotcha, but I love this technique. I use it everywhere. I will be posting some resource links when we're all done in the chat.
Please do.
Yes. So let's look at one other method. And now we'd like to be a little bit more explicit. Maybe we'd like to corral our elements, if we could say such a thing.
I would appreciate that, yeah.
Yes. So we're going to switch our method to use grid template areas. And we essentially can use, I'm going to say this wrong, probably, ASCII art to define what these should be is a comparable. So now I'm going to define using names, any names I would like. Fun little exercise for everyone. We all love naming things. I'm going to define that I will have a grid with 2 columns and 3 rows. I'm going to name my first column A, second column B, then move into a new row where I have first column in my second row, C, and then D. And the last row is going to be unique. It is going to have the same name for both columns so that any element placed in that row can spread across. Now, this hasn't quite happened, except for that the behavior that has happened is that each of these existing elements have flowed according to DOM order into these designated areas. Now, on this last one, I do need to be a little bit more explicit and define that this last child within my container should go ahead and take up that whole grid area of E. And there we go. So whereas I had mentioned that on our grid template columns, we can't force that behavior, grid template areas is one alternative around that. Grid template areas just overall lets us be more explicit about the template that we're going to use for our grid areas. Now, a misconception here is that this kind of disables our ability to use or to go without media queries. And this can be true. That said, in my experience, if I want to apply a behavior such as this, I'm usually talking at that point, I really am talking about whole page layout. And what we'll simply do is we can keep our grid, we can keep our gap, and we'll just go ahead and wrap up the template area part in a media query that applies above a certain breakpoint. And it's usually not too painful. There still isn't too much juggling of breakpoints to worry about in that
Doesn't
scenario.
sound too spooky. That sounds
not too spooky.
Just the right amount of spooky.
Yes, yes. So, after all, we don't want too many horses escaping from the pen, so sometimes it's good to have a little control.
Woody's Roundup is a TV show. It's not a fun thing to do every day. So yeah.
Yes, indeed. So I'm going to go back to our more simpler layout. And let's talk about a little bit different way to define this container's behavior. This technique is one of my favorites. I call it the stack. So if you don't catch everything in this, I will give you a resource where you can read a little bit more about it. We're going to use our grid template areas again, except this time we're only going to define a single one called the stack. Then we're going to follow that up by defining that each of the direct children of this container all take up that single grid area. Now, since they're numbered, you can see that they've all stacked on top of each other and they're all occupying the full grid space. Now, hopefully this works in your browser. I just realized since it's beaming over to you, hopefully your browser is supporting. Yep, we're good to go. So I've just changed the aspect ratio, by the way, great new property we have, of the container to 16:9, so standard video sort of format. And they've also, as you can see, still have the default behavior that they have stretched. They've all stretched, so they're all uniformly covering the grid area. Now, what I'm going to show you is essentially an alternative to what we may have done by using absolute positioning instead. So the first thing I've done is I've told all the elements to go to the center. I'm going to give us a little border so we can see the container. And then what we can do is individually, we're just doing it a really quick demo way this time, but we're going to use nth-child to select different elements. And using grid properties alone, we can place these in different spots on our container. Now, I've used this to stack elements on top of a video, which is really nice, or to create hero sort of elements, website header elements. And if you just need to, uniformly position things along different sides, this is really nice and handy. This will be the last one here. And if we resize, we can see how, of course, those are now maintain their relativeness to that point in the container. This is definitely more elements than I would typically, be working with here, but it definitely demonstrates the power of using grid alignment alone to do something like this. The
aspect ratio kept it at that same aspect ratio. That's fantastic.
Yep. I know we're getting down to our time. If we could do one more quick technique here.
Sure. And welcome, James Quick and Raiders. It's Steph Eckles stopped by for some trick-or-treating, and she's teaching us CSS Grid. Settle in.
Awesome. So what I'm going to do is, let's see. I want just two elements here, which are going to be a H1, Happy Halloween, of course. A few paragraphs. Again, this is Emmet, if you're unfamiliar with what I'm doing right here. And finally, I'm going to grab an image to insert in here. I'm going to increase the size on this. I'm using the Unsplash API just to help us out.
So there's some spooky pictures.
Whatever
stuff.
image it gives us. Yes,
Whoa,
very spooky. And so now we're going to, our goal is to adjust how these images span a grid that they're going to be assigned to. Now, the first thing I need to do is just remove some inherited padding that I had from my demo. Now everything's flush with the edges of the screen. Now on my container, we're going to use grid template columns again, but we're going to use a little different technique. We're going to combine naming our grid template areas with also defining their widths. So we can name multiple areas by using the format of start and end. And then when we assign it, we'll only have to refer to it by that base name. So my article, my setup here, is going to have one FR for a gutter on one side and one FR for the gutter on the other side. And then we're going to set up a middle area called really whatever we want. I'm going to go with content. So content start and content end. And so this is going to be where the bulk of our article lives. And for this, we're actually going to use a CSS function. So this is not specific to Grid. It's a CSS calculation function. And in here, we're going to say that the options, depending on the calculated width of all of our elements, will either be 100% minus 1 rem, we don't need a calc, or 40 ch. So the browser will choose whichever of those is smaller at a given time. Now, as we saw with our initial grid areas, they've just kind of hopped into spaces based on their DOM order. And what our objective is for our image to span full width. So from article start to article end, and the rest of it to sit within that content column. So we're going to simply use a selector to say everything not an image should go. And this time we're choosing grid column, and I know we're out of time. So this will go to content, and the next batch for just our image will simply go into the article column. And you can see the article spans full width and the rest does not. And I think I missed removing a margin or padding, but I know our time has come to an end.
This was
so
fantastic.
Thank you, and I will.
Whoa, spooky stuff.
I'll be putting
Steph,
some resource links out.
Yes, please do. Steph Eckles, thank you for showing us that grid is not as spooky as we thought. Oh my goodness. The whole content start, article start thing is super, super cool. I never ever use that, but I see why it's so useful. Thank you so much. And by that I mean this part, the bracket notation there. Thank you so much, chat. Give her a round of applause and welcome again, James Quicks people. Great to have you. Steph, happy Halloween. Thank you, Queen Steph, for coming through. Really appreciate it. And staying in character for so long was fantastic. Thank you, Steph. Take care. We'll see you.
Bye-bye.